I grew up on a sprawling ranch that had been in my family for over a century. Acres upon acres of open land, rolling hills, and a lake that shimmered like glass every morning. My grandfather built the ranch house himself with his own 2 hands, and it wasn't just property, it was our legacy. Every fence post, every cattle brand, and every stretch of soil told the story of generations who had poured their sweat into it. When my father passed it down to me, I swore I would protect it no matter what. But life had other plans. After college, I felt the call of duty. I enlisted in the army, and soon enough I was deployed overseas. It wasn't easy leaving the ranch behind, but I left it in the hands of a caretaker, a trusted neighbor who promised to watch over it while I was gone. I thought everything was safe, but what I didn't know was that while I was halfway around the world, my ranch had become the target of some of the greediest people in America, the Homeowners Association. You see, my property sat on the edge of a growing suburban development. What used to be endless farmland was now filled with rows of identical houses, all controlled by one of the strictest HOAs in the state. These people thought they owned everything they could see. They fined families for leaving their trash cans out 10 minutes too long, for painting their shutters the wrong shade of blue, even for planting the wrong kind of flowers. They had money, lawyers, and influence, and they were always on the lookout for more land to expand their grip. And right there, standing like a fortress of freedom, was my ranch. At first, the HOA sent me letters, dozens of them. My caretaker forwarded them, but I laughed them off. How could a homeowners association possibly dictate rules on a property that had been private land long before their subdivision even existed? My ranch wasn't part of their neighborhood, wasn't on their deed maps, and wasn't under their jurisdiction. Or so I thought. The letters became more aggressive, claiming my fencing was unsightly, my barns in violation of neighborhood standards, and that my livestock was not compatible with the character of the community. It was absurd. But then came the threats. According to the few calls I managed to make during my deployment, the HOA had started filing legal notices. They claimed unpaid community dues, demanded immediate compliance with their regulations, and hinted that if I didn't comply, they'd take further action. At first, I dismissed it as bluffing, the overreach of petty tyrants with too much time on their hands. But the thing about greed is, once it smells opportunity, it doesn't stop. While I was serving overseas, dodging bullets and protecting my country, the HOA hatched a plan. They fabricated documents, bribed officials, and pushed through a fraudulent foreclosure process on land they had no authority over. It was a slow and calculated theft. By the time my caretaker realized what was happening, the ranch had already been auctioned off in a community sale. And who bought it? The HOA itself, for pennies on the dollar. Now here's where things took a turn from infuriating to downright criminal. Not only did the HOA claim ownership of my ranch, but they also began dividing it into smaller parcels. They bulldozed parts of the pasture, destroyed the barns, and started selling plots to their members. My family's history, my inheritance, my land, it was being paved over for cookie-cutter houses with 2-car garages and plastic lawns. Meanwhile, I was thousands of miles away, serving in hostile territory, having no idea that my life back home was being dismantled piece by piece. All I knew was that something felt off. Letters from the caretaker grew more desperate, talking about construction crews on my land, fences torn down and neighbors moving in. He tried to fight them off legally, but the HOA had lawyers, endless funds, and local officials in their pocket. It was a losing battle. The day I got the full news was one I'll never forget. We had just returned from a long patrol, my unit exhausted and battered. I checked my messages, and there it was, a grainy video from my caretaker. In it, I saw my ranch house, my grandfather's house, being gutted by contractors. The land was marked with bright flags, survey stakes hammered into the soil like nails in a coffin. Families were moving into homes that had been thrown up on stolen ground. My ranch wasn't just taken, it was being erased. In that moment, something inside me snapped. I wasn't just a soldier serving overseas anymore. I was a man who had been robbed of his birthright, betrayed by a system that allowed greed to trample over justice. And I made a silent promise to myself right there in the dirt, rifle slung over my shoulder. When I came home, I wasn't coming back alone. The HOA thought they could bully one man, but they had no idea who I really was, or the brothers I had standing beside me. Because when the army comes home, we don't just fight for land. We fight for what's right. The last year of my deployment dragged on heavier than any before. Not because of the war zone, but because of the gnawing worry in my chest. I had seen the video of my ranch being torn apart, and every night when I tried to sleep on the hard ground overseas, I kept replaying it in my mind. My grandfather's barn, the one I learned to ride in, the one that still had his initials carved into the wood, gone in a heap of splinters. My cattle scattered. My lake drained and marked for construction. Every acre I had promised to protect had been stolen, brick by brick, deed by forged deed. And the worst part, I was powerless to stop it. The caretaker, Mr. Johnson, was an old family friend who had lived next door for decades. He had tried everything in his power to hold back the HOA. He went to town meetings, filed complaints, even called state representatives, but every door he knocked on slammed shut. The HOA board had money, and money bought influence. They painted my ranch as a nuisance, an eyesore holding back the progress of the community. They whispered lies about me being absent, irresponsible, even suggesting that my service overseas was a convenient excuse to abandon the land. The narrative stuck, and people who once respected my family began turning their heads away, too afraid to fight the machine. What still burns me to this day is how cunning the HOA was. They didn't just barge in and take the ranch overnight. No, they were strategic. They started by mailing me bogus dues statements, claiming I owed thousands in fees for shared community services I never agreed to. Of course, serving overseas, I didn't exactly have the luxury of fighting paperwork battles in a courthouse. They knew this. They counted on my absence. Every unpaid fine stacked on top of another, until suddenly they claimed I was delinquent. Then they manipulated zoning laws. With a few bribes slipped to the right hands at City Hall, they redrew district maps that conveniently included my ranch within HOA jurisdiction. It didn't matter that my land had stood independent for over 100 years. With a stroke of a pen, they declared it part of the community. From there, it was only a matter of time before they moved for foreclosure. Mr. Johnson tried to warn me, but communication lines were unreliable. Some weeks I'd go a month without internet or phone access. By the time I received his letters, weeks had passed. He begged me to come home, but I couldn't. Duty bound me to finish my deployment. It was like watching a slow-motion robbery, knowing you couldn't reach out to stop the thief's hand. The day the HOA officially auctioned off my ranch, I was deep in hostile territory, leading my squad through terrain that felt like hell on earth. That night, as gunfire echoed in the distance, the gavel fell in some pristine courthouse back home, and my entire inheritance was stolen for less than the price of a single suburban house. The HOA bought the land themselves, then immediately parceled it out into 36 lots for new development. 36 homes. 36 families who thought they were moving into their dream houses, completely unaware they were standing on the ruins of my family's blood and sweat. I can only imagine how Mr. Johnson felt, standing there watching bulldozers roll in. He told me later that he tried to block the gates with his pickup truck, waving the deed that proved my family's ownership. But the sheriff's deputies showed up, siding with the HOA's paperwork, threatening to arrest him if he interfered. A 70-year-old man, loyal to the core, forced to watch as strangers tore down fences he had helped me mend as a boy. And the betrayal didn't stop there. Neighbors, people who used to eat at our table during Sunday barbecues, turned their backs. Some even lined up to buy the new homes. They told themselves it was progress, that the ranch had to go eventually. But I know what it really was, fear. Nobody wanted to challenge the HOA because those who did found themselves buried in fines, lawsuits, and harassment until they gave up. The HOA wasn't just an organization. It was a cartel dressed in polo shirts and clipboards. When the new homes went up, they wiped away every trace of my family's history. The old windmill was torn down. The oak tree where I carved my initials as a boy was chopped and sold for lumber, and the lake was filled in to make room for a cul-de-sac. They called the development Heritage Meadows. The irony burned like acid in my veins. Heritage? They had destroyed my heritage. Overseas, I carried that rage with me. Every mission, every firefight, every sleepless night, I thought of my ranch. And with every thought, a plan began to form. They thought they could bury my history under concrete, But they didn't know me. They didn't know the kind of man I had become. They didn't know about the brothers I served with, men who knew loyalty, honor, and justice in ways those HOA crooks could never understand. By the time my deployment ended, I was no longer just a soldier coming home. I was a man on a mission, and I wasn't coming back alone. The HOA had made one critical mistake. They didn't just steal land. They stole from a soldier, and soldiers don't take kindly to betrayal. The army was coming home, and when it did, the HOA would regret every single brick they laid on my land. When my boots finally touched American soil, I expected the familiar rush of relief that comes with coming home from deployment. The smell of the air, the feel of the ground under my feet. It should have been comforting. So instead, the moment I stepped off the plane, I carried with me a knot of dread that no welcome home ceremony could untangle. For months, I'd been bracing myself for the sight of what the HOA had done to my family ranch. I told myself I was ready, but I wasn't, not even close. The drive from the airport was surreal. The closer I got to my hometown, the more alien everything felt. Fields I remembered from childhood were now flattened into shopping centers, old barns replaced with sterile warehouses. The town had grown, but it had lost its soul. When I turned down the road that once led to my ranch, my chest tightened. What used to be a quiet gravel path lined with oaks was now paved smooth and buzzing with traffic. Bright green signs pointed toward Heritage Meadows Community, and at the entrance stood a massive stone gateway with manicured flowers. My land, my home, had been turned into a postcard version of suburban perfection. I slowed the car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly, my knuckles turned white. As I drove through the gates, my eyes darted to every corner, searching for something familiar, something that would tell me I was still home. But all I saw were rows of identical houses, perfectly trimmed lawns, and smiling families unloading groceries. Children rode their bikes where my cattle once grazed. A dog barked where my lake once shimmered. The pit in my stomach grew heavier with each passing second. Finally, I stopped in front of what used to be the heart of my ranch, the old ranch house my grandfather built. Except it was gone. In its place stood a large modern home with 2 SUVs in the driveway. A woman in yoga pants waved cheerfully at a neighbor while unloading shopping bags from her trunk. Completely unaware she was living on stolen ground. My stolen ground, I sat in my car frozen. Memories came flooding back. My father teaching me to fish in the lake, my mother cooking dinner in the old kitchen, me as a boy chasing after calves in the pasture. Every piece of it was gone, paved over by people who probably thought this neighborhood had been built on nothing. My throat tightened and I felt the sting of rage boiling up. I couldn't sit there any longer. I slammed the car door shut and stormed toward the center of the development. The HOA clubhouse, a large brick building with the community logo plastered across the front, stood like a palace at the end of the cul-de-sac. This was their fortress, their throne room, and I was done being silent. Inside I found the board in session. A group of men and women in polo shirts sat around a glossy table, sipping coffee like they owned the world. The president, a man with slicked back hair and a smug smile, glanced up as I barged in. "Can we help you?" he asked, his tone dripping with condescension. "You know damn well who I am," I snapped, my voice echoing off the walls. "This land, my land, belonged to my family for over 100 years, and while I was overseas serving this country, you vultures stole it. I want answers now." The room fell silent for a moment before the president chuckled. "Ah, you must be Mr. Walker. We've heard about you. Look, I understand you're upset, but everything was handled legally. Notices were sent, fines weren't paid, and eventually the property was foreclosed. You abandoned it. We followed procedure." I stepped closer, slamming my hands on the table. "Abandoned? I was fighting for my country, while you forged paperwork and bribed officials. You think you can hide behind procedure? Not with me." The smug smiles around the table only grew. One board member leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "Listen, soldier boy, you weren't here. The community voted, the courts approved, and now families are living here. It's done. You should move on, maybe find a nice condo in town. Heritage Meadows isn't for people like you. People like me." The words hit like a slap. My jaw tightened, but I didn't lash out, not yet. They wanted me to lose control, to be the angry veteran they could dismiss. Instead, I leaned in close, my voice low and steady. "You made one mistake," I said. You thought you were fighting one man, but I didn't come back alone. You've woken something you don't understand. You can't bulldoze honor, you can't foreclose loyalty, and you sure as hell can't erase a soldier's family legacy. The president smirked, clearly unimpressed. Is that a threat? No, I replied. It's a promise. I walked out, my blood boiling, my fists clenched so tightly, my nails dug into my palms. Outside I saw neighbors peeking through blinds, watching me as if I were the intruder, on my own land. I felt humiliated, betrayed, but also more determined than ever. That night I drove to Mr. Johnson's place. The old man opened the door, his eyes welling with tears when he saw me standing there. He hugged me tight, whispering, "I'm sorry, son. I tried everything." They were too powerful. I shook my head. You did more than anyone could have. Now it's my turn. Over a pot of coffee, he told me everything. The bribes, the secret meetings, the sheriff turning a blind eye. The corruption ran deeper than I imagined. But as I listened, a plan began forming in my mind. This wasn't going to be a battle I could fight alone. I needed allies, brothers who knew how to face impossible odds. The HOA thought they had won. They thought I was just one man, broken and beaten. But they were about to learn that when you betray a soldier, you don't just fight him. You fight every brother and sister, whoever wore the uniform beside him. And we were coming for them. The morning after confronting the HOA board, I woke with a burning fire in my chest. Rage alone wasn't going to reclaim my ranch. These people had money, lawyers, and political influence. They thought I was outmatched. But what they didn't count on was the brotherhood I had forged in the army. I wasn't alone, and I never would be. That afternoon, I made the calls. One by one, I reached out to the men and women I'd served with overseas, people who had my back in firefights, who'd dragged me out of danger, who knew what loyalty meant. Every single one of them listened quietly as I explained what the HOA had done, how they'd stolen my ranch while I was serving my country, bulldozed my family's history, and sold it off piece by piece. The responses were immediate and unanimous. "Say the word," my old squad leader growled over the phone. "We're in." Another brother-in-arms, a logistics expert, laughed darkly. "They don't know who they messed with. We'll handle this." One by one, they pledged their support. I wasn't just a man anymore. I was the tip of a spear sharpened by a dozen veterans who refused to let injustice stand. Within a week, they started arriving. My quiet little hometown suddenly had an influx of soldiers, men and women in jeans and boots, but carrying themselves with that unmistakable discipline. Neighbors noticed them instantly. Some whispered in fear, others in awe. To the HOA, it must have looked like the cavalry rolling in, and in a way it was. We set up our base of operations in Mr. Johnson's barn, the last untouched relic of the old days. Maps of the development were spread across tables, along with laptops, notebooks, and boxes of files Johnson had saved from his desperate battle. Every fine, every notice, every shady zoning change, it was all there. And now it was in the hands of people trained to dissect intelligence like it was enemy communication. "Look at this," said Ramirez, our comms expert, pointing at a string of documents. They backdated these notices. That's fraud, plain and simple. And here, added Lewis, who had worked in logistics and procurement, they overbilled for community improvements. That's embezzlement. The more we dug, the more the rot revealed itself. The HOA president and his cronies weren't just greedy. They were criminals. They had laundered money through shell companies, bribed inspectors to look the other way, and even falsified foreclosure documents with forged signatures. They thought no one would ever notice, but they hadn't counted on a group of veterans trained to spot deception like a landmine in the sand. It wasn't just about finding dirt, it was about strategy. We knew we couldn't just storm in and take the houses back. This wasn't war. It was worse. It was bureaucracy, red tape, and a system designed to protect those who knew how to manipulate it. But that's where our discipline kicked in. We treated it like a mission. Step 1, gather intel. Step 2, expose corruption. Step 3, apply pressure. Ramirez set up secure lines of communication, ensuring the HOA couldn't snoop on our plans. Lewis coordinated with local activists, rallying the community members who had quietly suffered under HOA tyranny for years. And me, I became the face of the fight. I was the wronged soldier, the man whose story could spark outrage and force people to pay attention. We launched a media campaign. Local news stations picked up the story of the veteran whose ranch was stolen while he served overseas. Suddenly, cameras were outside the gates of Heritage Meadows, asking uncomfortable questions the board couldn't dodge. The HOA tried to paint me as unstable, but the more they attacked me, the more the public rallied behind me. Veterans groups reached out. Politicians began sniffing around, sensing an opportunity. The HOA was losing its grip, but we didn't stop there. We staged community meetings, inviting every resident of Heritage Meadows to hear the truth. Many of them had no idea their dream homes were built on stolen land. We showed them documents, evidence of fraud, and even video testimony from Mr. Johnson. People who once saw me as an intruder began to see me as the victim. The cracks in the HOA's armor were spreading. Still, the board didn't back down. They hired more lawyers, doubled their security, and even tried to intimidate us with bogus restraining orders. But intimidation doesn't work on soldiers who faced real danger. Every move they made only hardened our resolve. One night, as we sat around the barn table, my squad leader grinned. "You know what this feels like," he said. "It feels like we're back in the sandbox planning an op. Only this time the enemy wears loafers instead of combat boots." We laughed, but we knew the stakes were deadly serious. This wasn't just about my ranch anymore. It was about standing up to a system of corruption that had bullied countless families into submission. We were fighting for every person who'd ever been crushed by greedy HOAs. As the weeks went on, pressure mounted. Investigations were launched at the state level. Residents began demanding answers. The HOA board was cornered, but like any desperate enemy, they lashed out. They sent threats, hired private security to harass us, and even vandalized Mr. Johnson's property. But they underestimated our resilience. Every attack only fueled our determination. And then came the breaking point. We discovered bank records that directly tied the HOA president to illegal kickbacks from developers. It was the smoking gun we needed, the kind of evidence that could topple their empire. I remember standing there in the barn, holding those papers in my hands, my brothers and sisters around me. "This is it," I said. "This is how we bring them down. Not with fists, not with guns, but with the truth." The army had come home, and now the real battle was about to begin. The barn felt electric the night we finalized our plan. We weren't carrying rifles or armored trucks, but the energy was the same as it had been before every mission overseas. Maps covered the walls, files were stacked like ammo crates, and a dozen veterans stood ready, eyes burning with determination. Only this time, the battlefield wasn't a desert halfway around the world. It was a suburban neighborhood run by crooks in polo shirts. We had everything we needed: proof of fraud, evidence of bribery, records of illegal foreclosures, and even video clips of residents breaking down as they described the HOA's harassment. But evidence was useless unless it was delivered with precision. We had to expose them publicly, make sure there was no chance they could bury the truth. That's when Ramirez suggested the town hall ambush. The HOA board held a mandatory community meeting once a month in their pristine clubhouse. It was their stage, their place to gloat and enforce rules, but we decided it would be the site of their downfall. The day of the meeting, we rolled up in trucks, calm and organized. We weren't there to cause chaos. We were there to drop a hammer of truth. Inside, the board sat smugly at their table, looking out over dozens of residents seated in neat rows. Most people attended these meetings out of fear, afraid that skipping would mean another fine. The board fed off that fear. The president tapped his gavel. "Meeting called to order," he said, smiling like a man who thought he had already won. "Let's begin with community dues." "Not so fast," I interrupted, stepping forward with my team flanking me like a wall of steel. The room fell silent. All eyes turned toward us. Some residents gasped when they recognized me, the soldier who'd been wronged. The president sneered. "Mr. Walker, you are not welcome here. This is private property." I didn't flinch. "Funny," I said, holding up a thick folder of documents, "because this private property sits on land you stole. And tonight everyone in this room is going to hear how you did it." Gasps rippled through the crowd. The president's face reddened. "Remove him," he barked to two security guards at the back. But before they could move, Ramirez stood and projected the first slide onto a large screen we had wheeled in. It was a scanned copy of the falsified foreclosure notice, complete with mismatched signatures. The room went dead silent. "This," Ramirez said calmly, "is fraud. This is how your board manufactured authority it never had." Residents craned their necks, whispering. The guards hesitated, unsure if they wanted to throw out veterans who looked like they meant business. Next, Lewis stepped forward with a stack of bank statements. "Here are records showing over $50,000 in payments made from a developer to the HOA president, right before your community expansion plan passed." He held the papers high. "That's bribery. Plain and simple." Murmurs grew into outrage. A woman in the crowd stood up. "I was fined for having the wrong flowers in my garden while you were pocketing bribes." "Sit down," the president shouted, his voice cracking under the pressure. But no one sat down. Another veteran, Davis, played video clips of residents who had been bullied and harassed. One woman broke down crying on screen, explaining how she'd been threatened with foreclosure over a missing fence slat. The crowd was boiling now, their anger turning on the board that had lorded over them for years. I stepped back into the center, holding up the final piece of evidence, a deed proving my ranch had been in my family's name long before the HOA even existed. "You stole my land," I said, my voice steady but filled with fire. "You destroyed my family's legacy. And you thought no one would stand up to you. But tonight your reign ends." The residents erupted, shouting, demanding resignation, some even storming toward the board's table. The president banged his gavel desperately, screaming for order, but the tide had turned. For the first time, the people weren't afraid. They were furious. By the end of the night, half the board had fled under police escort. The evidence we presented was already being sent to state investigators and local reporters waiting outside. Cameras flashed as we stepped out of the clubhouse, the story spreading like wildfire. The HOA's image of control had been shattered, but the battle wasn't over. Corrupt men don't go down without a fight. The very next morning, the board's lawyers filed lawsuits against me and several veterans, accusing us of defamation and trespassing. They claimed everything we presented was fabricated. We expected that. Anticipated it, even. Our counterattack was swift. We leaked more documents to the press, ensuring the HOA couldn't bury the story. Veterans organizations across the country began rallying behind us, calling it an insult to all servicemen and women that my ranch had been stolen while I was deployed. The HOA was suddenly facing national attention, something their lawyers couldn't spin away. The pressure mounted daily. Residents refused to pay dues. Protesters showed up at the gates of Heritage Meadows with signs that read, "Give back the ranch and stop HOA tyranny." News vans parked on the streets. Every newscast brought more shame, more heat. That week, investigators raided the HOA office and seized records. The president's smug grin finally cracked when he was led out in handcuffs for obstruction of justice. One by one, the other board members fell under scrutiny. Fraud, bribery, embezzlement, it was all coming to light. Watching it unfold was surreal. The same people who once dismissed me as an angry veteran now shook my hand in the grocery store, thanking me for standing up. Families who had lived under the HOA's iron fist finally felt free to breathe. And my brothers in arms? They stood beside me every step. Not for glory, not for revenge, but because it was the right thing to do. But the mission wasn't complete. Exposing the HOA was one thing. Reclaiming my land was another. And that final step would be the hardest. The army had broken the enemy's defenses. Now it was time to march in and take back what was rightfully mine. The fall of the HOA board was only the beginning. For Jack, victory wasn't about exposing corruption alone. It was about restoring the soul of his family's land, the ranch that had been stolen and desecrated. Every inch of that soil carried his father's sweat, his grandfather's dreams, and his own memories. To see it chopped into cookie-cutter suburban homes was like seeing a graveyard paved over for profit. He wanted it back, not in fragments, but whole. The legal battle stretched for months, but Jack had something the HOA never did: patience and loyalty. His brothers and sisters from the army rotated in and out of town, each bringing skills to the fight. Some worked with lawyers to untangle the fraudulent deeds. Others pressured state legislators, while still others rallied the community to keep media attention burning hot. One by one, the fraudulent sales unraveled. Families who had unknowingly bought homes built on Jack's ranch were shocked to learn their deeds were void. At first, they turned their anger on him. "We didn't steal this land. It's not our fault," one family cried. Jack didn't hate them. They were victims too. Instead of pushing them out, he offered a solution: compensation from the HOA's seized accounts, plus state grants that his unit had fought to secure. Those families moved on with dignity, grateful that Jack treated them with the honor the HOA had never shown. But not everyone left quietly. A handful of arrogant buyers, mostly investors and speculators who had known about the shady deals, dug in their heels. They hired lawyers, dragged their feet, and even tried to intimidate Jack into backing down. But intimidation was useless against a soldier who had stared down warlords overseas. Jack remained calm, steady, and relentless. When the state finally ruled that all properties built on the ranch were illegally sold, the order was clear: every house would be reclaimed, and the land restored to Jack. Bulldozers lined the streets, not to destroy for greed this time, but to clear the scars left behind. Each demolition felt like justice. Neighbors cheered as the last traces of the HOA's empire fell brick by brick. The day the final house came down, Jack stood on the highest hill of his land. His army brothers stood beside him, the wind whipping across the wide-open fields. For the first time since he'd returned from overseas, he felt peace. The ranch was bare again, but it was alive. He could almost hear his father's voice in the breeze. "This land was always ours. You fought for it once in uniform, and again here. You never stopped being a soldier." But Jack didn't just want the land back. He wanted to give it a new purpose. He and his unit rebuilt the ranch into something greater than before. They opened it as a retreat for veterans, a sanctuary for those who needed healing after service. Horses roamed free again, fields bloomed, and cabins were raised for families who needed refuge. What had once been stolen was now shared, but on his terms, terms of honor and brotherhood. The community that had once bowed to the HOA now rallied around Jack. They helped plant trees, build fences, and restore barns. Children who had once played under HOA surveillance now laughed freely in open pastures. The fear was gone, replaced by unity. And what a victor the HOA president who had orchestrated it all. He ended up behind bars, his smirk wiped away as he faced years of prison time for fraud, theft, and conspiracy. The last time Jack saw him was in court. Victor had tried to lock eyes with him, perhaps to glare, perhaps to beg. Jack didn't bother returning the look. To him, Victor was already a ghost, forgotten by the land he had tried to steal. The army had a saying Jack lived by: "We leave no man behind." On the ranch, he added his own vow: "We leave no legacy stolen." The land wasn't just dirt and grass. It was history, sacrifice, and resilience. And now it stood as a testament to what happens when ordinary people, led by extraordinary loyalty, take a stand against corruption. As the sun set over his reclaimed fields, Jack raised a glass with his brothers. They toasted not just to victory, but to survival, justice, and family. The ranch was his again, but more importantly, it was whole. And this time, no bored, no greedy neighbor, no self-important HOA would ever take it from him. The HOA had underestimated a soldier. They thought he was just one man. But when they stole his ranch, they didn't just pick a fight with him. They picked a fight with an army. And the army never loses.